So here it is, guys, week 3 of King of Hearts. If you missed out on week 1 and week 2, check it out on this channel or head over to our Spotify or any of our podcast channels.
Well, hey there, Elevate family. Great to have you with us for this 3rd week of our series, King of Hearts. And this series, we're taking a very deep dive, looking at the life and leadership of David. David became the 2nd king of Israel, was famous for writing at least half of the Psalms that we still have, the Songbook of Israel. And really, the gold standard is that David has been described as a person after God's own heart. And so we're looking at what really he did through his life that would ultimately have that compliment, that affirmation spoken of him, things that we can learn not just for historical knowledge, but for application in our own lives, that we can become people who are known as people after God's own heart. And so week 1, we talked about the heart God favors, this idea that life is lived inside out, which is very countercultural. You know, we live in a culture where it's all about the externals. I mean, just watch an episode of Love Island UK and you'll know what I mean. No, I don't recommend you watch an episode of Love Island UK. Just take my word for it. But it's very, very much about the externals. But if life is indeed lived inside out, then our priority ought to be to develop our heart. Now, week 2, we talked about the worshipful heart. This idea that David, having been anointed as the next king of Israel, but not yet appointed, was in the gap, in the waiting room. And neither God nor David was passive while they were waiting. God was working while David was waiting, and David was worshiping while he was waiting. And there's a big, big lesson for us there. Now, because we're actually walking through the timeline of David's life, hitting the high points, well, also the low points, but ultimately, sequentially, it makes sense for you to go back and listen to the first 2 episodes if you missed either of them. Any of the major podcast platforms, you'll find us. Just type in or search for Elevate Church Perth and we'll be there. And that'll give you this kind of idea of how David's life unfolded. Now, today I want to talk about the courageous heart. You know, last week we in talking about waiting, you know, we recognize that waiting is something that we all have to do. It's something we all experience. Well, guess what? So is fear. You know, we might have different fears. We might have fears to different extents, but the reality is at some point we all experience fear. But get this, Robert Lee, the author of The Worry Cure, he cites studies that confirm that around or at least 85% of the things that we fear and worry about never actually take place. And he cites that of the 15% of things that do actually take place, 79% of the subjects cited that either they discovered they could handle it better than they initially anticipated, or that going through the experience taught them valuable life lessons. And so the conclusion for this, 85% of things don't come to reality, and of the 15%, there's a lot of good that can come out of them. The reality is we give fear way, way too much room in our hearts. And it's not a new phenomenon. In fact, if you read through the entire Bible, you'll see 2 things. One, you'll read that God says, don't fear 63 times, which is, you know, it's not a small number. And he instructs us to not be controlled by fear over 300 times. He said that and he recognized that because he understood that people give fear too much room in their hearts and that is not God's best for us. In fact, one of the most famous things that Paul ever wrote, he wrote it to one of his mentees, a young leader named Timothy. And Timothy was like young, early 20s, leading a church, presumably with people who are older and maybe considered in that culture wiser and more capable and qualified than him. maybe questioning himself, what does a young buck like me have to offer these people in my community? Not married, no kids. Paul wrote to him and said, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline." So David gives us a working example of the triumph of courage over fear. And yep, no guessing which time in his life he gave that example. Really, it's the most famous battle that's been recorded in the Bible. Something that is so famous it's made its way into our modern vernacular to describe something where there's kind of an unlikely underdog and a more presumptive victor. David versus Goliath. Now, this showdown takes place in a valley called Elah Valley. So what we have on either side of the valley is two armies. On one side of the valley is the Israel army. On the other side of the valley, on a hilltop, is the Philistine army. And among the Philistine army was a standout warrior named Goliath. Okay, now he's believed to and recorded to have been 7 to 9 plus feet tall, like approaching 3 meters. Whether he was 7 feet, 8 feet, 9, look, he was tall, okay? Even by NBA standards, he was tall. And he was not just like skinny, lanky tall, he was like jacked tall. And every morning and every evening, he would step in front of his fellow soldiers and he would look to the Israel army across the other side of the valley and he would taunt them. Every morning and every evening for 40 days. And he would taunt them, daring someone to come out and face him in battle. Because what was happening there wasn't like a Braveheart, everyone rush to fight each other kind of battle. It was what's known as representative battle, where one soldier from one army would be tapped to take on one soldier from the other army. And they would fight each other one-on-one. And whoever won, their entire nation would take over the defeated nation. Possessions, land, and the people in the defeated nation would become slaves to the victorious nation. So this was kind of a big deal. So Goliath, he was willing to step forward and be the representative for the Philistine army, but he couldn't find any takers from the Israel army. In fact, it's recorded in Samuel that on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul, the king, and all the Israelites, the Israelite soldiers, were dismayed and terrified. And this taunting went on every morning and every evening for 40 days. Very effective. Until day 40, a young man named David arrived on the Israelite front lines, and the game soon changed. Now, among the Israelite soldiers was 3 of David's older brothers. So David, he was too young and would have been considered unqualified to be part of the army anyway. He just he kept his regular job as a shepherd, tending the family sheep. Well, his dad, Jesse, was concerned about the 3 sons that were on the front lines, as a loving, caring dad would be. So he summoned David, and particularly this day, and said, "Listen, I want you to take some, literally bread, some cheese. I want you to take them to the front lines, give them to your brothers and some of their fellow soldiers. And then I want you to come back with a report." So it's like, I want to know how they're doing, and I want them to know that Dad loves them and is concerned for them. Well, David did that. David said yes to his father. The anointed future king of Israel said yes to his father. Now, by the time that David had arrived on the front lines, Saul, having had no takers, started offering incentives to his soldiers. Incentives of fame, incentives of fortune. Just saying, like, if just one of you steps forward, and takes on Goliath and wins, I'm going to make it worth your while. And there was no takers. In contrast, David wasn't sent to the front lines to fight Goliath. He was sent by his dad as history's first ever recorded Uber Eats delivery driver, the anointed next king of Israel, delivering a care package. One of the things that David could have done, by the way, and it's important not to miss this, is he could have said to his dad, I'm the next king of Israel. I don't do food delivery. But he didn't, because that's not the spirit that he'd been cultivating. In fact, this is what he did. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse, his dad, had directed. Faithfulness in the little things matters. In fact, how you handle small assignments is a clue to how you will handle bigger assignments. Not only that, how you and I handle small assignments is actually a clue as to whether we'll ultimately be entrusted with more responsibility, with bigger assignments. Jesus said it this way: whoever can be trusted with very little, it's a clue, can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little, it's a clue, will also be dishonest with much. And this applies to all areas of life and leadership. And there's two mistakes we can make when we're asked to do small things. One, we can say, like, begrudgingly do them, but just not do them well. Convince ourselves it's just a small thing, it doesn't really matter. No one's watching, not huge consequence, and we don't bring our best. Or we convince ourselves that when I get the bigger assignments, then I'm going to put in the effort. Then I'm going to bring my best. And yet, no, Jesus says you won't get to be entrusted with more if your spirit and your heart and your commitment isn't being diligent and bringing your best to the little. And so here we see the next king of Israel got up early, didn't hand off his responsibility looking after the sheep. He got another shepherd in, and he maintained his portfolio there. And just leave the sheep abandoned by themselves. And then it's described that he did everything just as his dad directed. He didn't cut corners. He wasn't sloppy. He didn't take shortcuts. This is the heart of the next king of Israel that's been described as a person after God's own heart. And get this, and look, I may be stating the obvious here, but it was the very fact that he did this thing that transported him literally onto the front lines of the battle, positioned near the valley to fight the giant. Now, we're about to turn to the Bible. Just before you do, something that we're highlighting over the course of this teaching series is this here. This is a code. Open your smartphone camera now and scan this. And what this will do is it'll take you to the Bible app, and it'll allow you to set Elevate Church as your church in the Bible app. And what we're doing is every single week on a Monday, we're adding a new featured plan around the life and leadership of David in the Bible app, and you'll be able to see it directly by the fact that you've set Elevate Church as your church. So that's super easy, super easy. Now, speaking of the Bible app and scanning, get your phone. This is a flow code. If you zoom in and scan this right now, it will take you to the slice of the Bible that I want us to drop into now. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now, while you're doing that, let me give you the up-to-date context. Goliath, once again, in the morning, stepped forward and started taunting the Israelites. Saul and all of his trained soldiers continued to be dismayed and terrified. Only this time, a young shepherd boy named David heard the taunt of Goliath. And his response was very different from Saul and the Israel army. Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? David wasn't afraid. He was furious. He was indignant. Now, we all have something in common with the Israelites. In fact, we all have something in common with David. We will, on more than one occasion in our life, face giants. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The knock-on question is, what's our response going to be? Is it going to look like Saul and the Israelite army, or is it going to look more like David? And if you want it to look more like David, how can we get there? Well, first of all, it's vital to remember your past victories. It's a good chance that the next giant you face isn't going to be the first giant you've ever faced. And the fact that you're facing a new giant means that the one that you faced before, and maybe before that, you've actually lived to tell the story. And the same God that got you through the last giant and the one before that and the one before that is ready, willing, and able to be with you to tackle this next giant. And fear can obscure that. Fear can allow us to become overwhelmed, take up too much space in our heart, to focus on the giant instead of focusing on the God who's brought us through in victories in the past. And that itself is a huge difference maker. And so the indignant David fronts up to the king, who he knew, by the way, because he'd spent some time, as I talked about last week, in the court of the king, playing worship music to the king, volunteered. Saul had been looking for someone, not a volunteer, a professional soldier, to step up. David, not a part of the army, literally volunteers to take on Goliath. Now remember, Goliath, 9 feet, 3 meters tall. By contrast, David's less than 5 feet, less than 1.5 meters. Would have been a little bit like this: Shaquille O'Neal and Olympic gold medal gymnast Simone Biles. I mean, even more, but you get the idea. Yeah. Well, it's no surprise when you look at this kind of contrast that Saul pushed back. "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight the Philistine or possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "And when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. Have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." He's remembering his past victories. Still, on the surface, this looks like a very unfair, impossible contest. Nobody in either camp, when they're getting wind that this scrawny David's willing to take on this giant Goliath, is opening their sports betting app and putting some money on David. I can be pretty confident of that. And ironically, by contrast, at least looking at the externals, the most qualified candidate for taking on Goliath was actually King Saul. King Saul is described as being head and shoulders taller than everybody else. He's a trained warrior. He's actually experienced in battle. If Saul had stepped up, it would have been more like this, a Shaq versus Charles Barkley situation, not versus Simone Biles. But Saul didn't step up, and David did. And if you've been tracking with us over the last couple of weeks, this kind of shouldn't come as a big surprise, because here's the thing. Over time, Saul's momentum when it comes to his faith and reliance on God was moving away from God. And all the while, David's momentum when it comes to his faith and relying on God was moving towards God. And so Saul was looking at and focusing on Goliath, whilst David was looking at and focusing on the God of victory. So, fast forward, David picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in his shepherd's bag. And then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Well, as Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag, taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down. Now, this is essentially what David's sling would have looked like. He didn't take it there to fight Goliath. He would have just had it tucked away because it was just part of his everyday, weaponry as a shepherd. Not very intimidating. On the surface, not very threatening, but it was ultimately the weapon that took Goliath down. And things could have gone very differently if David had have taken a different approach. See, let's just rewind briefly. When David first volunteered, Saul said, all right, okay, let's give it a shot. Nothing to lose. I'm not paying you anyway. Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he'd never worn such things before. Oh, I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off again. If David had gone into battle with Saul's armor as a sub 5 foot kid, armed with a sword, he would have got massacred. He wouldn't have been able to reach Goliath before Goliath killed him. And then when David ran into battle with just his sling and a shepherd's staff, but again, he didn't take that to fight Goliath. He just had it on him because he's a shepherd. David replied to the Philistine, because the Philistine's like, really? This is the best they can do? David replied to the Philistine, you come at me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. Once again, largely things that are for close combat. And if David had tried to match Goliath by fighting Goliath's way, he would never have won. But what David did is he didn't fight Saul's way. He didn't fight Goliath's way. He took into battle his gifts, his strength, his experience, his uniqueness, and God used those things to ultimately defeat Goliath. And one of the mistakes we can make when we're facing a giant is to look at what we don't have and think that somehow disqualifies us from ever defeating that giant. We might look at what other people have. If only I had their job or their spouse or their kids or their bank account, then I might be able to defeat the giant in front of me. Now, I say this regularly. Make sure you look to other people to be inspired by them, to learn from them. However, God's not calling you to be them. God's calling you to be you. Now, the best version of you, the stretch version of you, but ultimately take what it is that God's put in your hand uniquely, and with His power and His presence and His strength and His courage, take those things into battling your giants. And God promises that together you will be victorious.